Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are tackling one of the greatest conceptual puzzles in all of biology. It's a question so profound that Darwin himself called it the mystery of mysteries, the origin of new life forms.
That's right. And you can see it perfectly in something like the Galapagos flightless cormorant. I mean, here's a bird that clearly came from flying ancestors but evolved into something entirely new.
That's the result of speciation, right?
That is speciation in a nutshell. It's a process where one species splits into two.
So it's the mechanism that takes one thing and turns it into two or more distinct things. It's like the ultimate evolutionary division.
It truly is. And this process, it's the absolute conceptual bridge between microevolution.
The small stuff.
Mm.
Changes in allele frequencies.
Exactly. The small stuff we can see happening generation to generation. And it connects that to macroevolution, the grand sweep of life. We're talking about the origin of mammals, the big patterns. If you don't get how one species becomes two, you can't really get the diversity of life on Earth.
So our mission today is, well, twofold.
Yeah.
First, we need to figure out the biological rules,
Mm-hmm.
what defines the border between two species.
Mm-hmm.
And second, we need to explore the specific circumstances, geographic and genetic, that force a population to actually cross that border.
Yeah.
So let's start with the definition. How do scientists even draw that line? I mean, you have two birds, like the eastern and western meadowlarks. They look almost identical, but they're different species.
Yeah.
And then you have Chihuahua and Great Dane. They look nothing alike, but they're absolutely the same species.
Well, that's because looks can be deceiving. And that brings us to the cornerstone idea here, the biological species concept, or BSC.
Okay.
It defines a species not by how it looks, but by its reproductive potential. So a species is a group of populations whose members can interbreed in nature and, crucially, produce viable, fertile offspring.
So the force holding a species together is just the movement of genes.
Exactly. We call it gene flow. It's this exchange of alleles between populations, and it acts like a kind of cohesive force. It keeps the whole gene pool of the species unified.
Which means speciation must be the total breakdown of that gene flow.
The total breakdown. And that's achieved through something called reproductive isolation.
So these are like biological walls, barriers that stop mating or block the formation of viable hybrids, the offspring of two different species.
Right. And the sources break these barriers down really nicely. You can think of them in two big groups, the ones that act before fertilization, which we call prezygotic, and the ones that act after, the postzygotic ones.
Okay, let's look at those prezygotic ones first.
Yeah.
The ones that prevent mating from even happening. So you've got barriers based on what time and place.
Right. So you've got habitat isolation. Two species might live in the same general area, but they use different habitats. The apple maggot fly is a perfect example. Some live on hawthorn trees, others use apple trees. They just don't run into each other.
They're in their own little worlds.
Exactly. Then there's temporal isolation, isolation by time. The western spotted skunk mates in late summer. The eastern one mates in late winter. Same region, but their schedules just don't line up.
They completely miss each other's mating season.
Totally. Another key prezygotic type is behavioral isolation. Think of the blue-footed booby.
The famous dance.
The famous dance. The male has to do this very specific high-step ritual. If a male from another species tried it, the female just wouldn't recognize the signal. No dance, no mating. It's like a species-specific password.
And sometimes the barrier is just physical, which is wild.
That's mechanical isolation. We see this in some snails. The direction their shell spirals, left or right, is genetic. If two snails spiral in opposite directions, their bodies just don't align. Mating is physically impossible.
It's like trying to fit the wrong key in a lock.
A perfect analogy. And even if all of that works, you still have one last gatekeeper. Gametic isolation. This is on a cellular level. So sea urchins, for example, they just release their eggs and sperm into the water. For fertilization to happen, proteins on the surface of the egg and sperm have to bind perfectly. If they're different species, those proteins don't match. The sperm can't get in.
Wow. So even if a hybrid zygote somehow does form against all those odds, we then get to the postzygotic barriers, which make sure the mixed genes don't really go anywhere.
Right. The most famous example here is reduced hybrid fertility, the mule. It's a hybrid of a horse and a donkey. It's strong, it's robust, a great animal.
But it's sterile.
But it's sterile. Because the parents have different numbers of chromosomes, the mule can't make viable sperm or eggs. The genetic line ends right there.
And what about when the hybrid is okay at first, but things fall apart later?
That's a great point. That's called hybrid breakdown. You see it in some strains of cultivated rice. The first generation, the F1 hybrids, are perfectly healthy and fertile. But when they reproduce, Their kids, the F2 generation, are small, frail, and sterile. The lineage just collapses.
It's amazing how many layers of protection there are. But this concept, the BSC, it has limits, right? I mean, it's all about sexual reproduction.
Exactly. So you can't apply it to asexual species like bacteria or to anything we only know from the fossil record.
So what do scientists use then?
Well, there are alternatives. The morphological species concept just uses body shape and structure, very useful for fossils or for quick identification in the field.
And the other one?
The ecological species concept. It defines a species by its unique ecological niche, how it interacts with its environment. This works really well for asexual organisms.
And of course, just to make things complicated, biology gives us things like the growler bear, a grizzly polar bear hybrid.
Right, it shows that a little gene flow can sometimes happen, but usually natural selection either weeds those hybrids out or just pushes the parent species even further apart.
Okay, so that's the what. Now for the how and where. The geographic modes. This is where speciation happens out in the wild. We got two main scenarios.
Yep. One where populations are physically split apart, and one where they split up while living in the same place.
Let's start with the first one, allopatric speciation.
The other homeland. This is maybe the easier one to grasp. It's when gene flow gets cut off by a physical barrier. A mountain range forms, a river changes its course, something like that.
But the barrier itself isn't the reproductive isolation, right? It just starts the process.
That's the crucial distinction. The barrier creates the isolation. But the reproductive barrier, like a new mating preference, is a byproduct of natural selection working differently in those two separate places.
The mosquito fish experiment is a great example of this.
The Gambusia fish, yeah. On Andros Islands, some ponds have predators, some don't. In the predator ponds, fish evolved to be super streamlined and fast. In the safe ponds, they evolved for slower, steadier swimming.
And when you put them back together.
The females strongly preferred to mate with males that had the body shape from their own type of pond.
Wait, but is that real speciation or just a strong preference?
Well, that preference is genetic, and it acts as a very real behavioral reproductive barrier. The fish from the safe pond are now effectively unwilling to mate with the fish from the predator pond. They've diverged reproductively.
And for real-world proof, we just have to look at the Isthmus of Panama.
No, absolutely. When that land bridge rose up about 3 million years ago, it separated the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And today, we find 15 different pairs of sister species of snapping shrimp, one on each side.
15 different speciation events just from that one barrier.
Exactly.
So that's what happens when a huge wall goes up.
Yeah.
But what about sympatric speciation? Speciation in the same homeland. How does that even happen when they're all mingling?
That's the puzzle. Gene flow is high, so something has to reduce it internally and drastically. The most dramatic way this happens, especially in plants, is polyploidy.
That's when an organism gets extra sets of chromosomes.
You got it. An error in cell division gives you an individual with, say, 4 sets instead of 2, and that new individual is instantly reproductively isolated. Because if that 4-set plant tries to breed with a normal 2-set plant, the offspring will have 3 sets, an odd number. That makes it almost certainly sterile. Boom, a new species in a single generation.
And a lot of our crops, like bread wheat, came from this process.
A classic example. Bread wheat is an allopolyploid. It came from a hybridization between 2 different species, followed by a chromosome doubling event that stabilized the whole genome and made it a new, fertile species.
So beyond that genetic accident, what else can drive sympatric speciation?
2 big things. Sexual selection and habitat differentiation. For sexual selection, you just have to look at the cichlid fish in Lake Victoria.
Right.
You have closely related species, but the males are different colors. Some are blue, some are red, and the females have a very strong preference for males of their own color. That mate choice is a powerful prezygotic barrier even when they're swimming right next to each other.
And for habitat, we're back to the apple maggot fly.
We are. Because when some of those flies started using apple trees instead of their native hawthorns, it created a division. Apples ripen earlier, so selection favored flies that matured faster. This created a time-based temporal isolation from the original population, all from switching to a new food source in the same orchard.
Okay, so we've got populations diverging. What happens if they meet again? This is where we get a hybrid zone, right?
Exactly. A hybrid zone is a narrow geographic region where these 2 diverging species meet and interbreed. They're amazing natural laboratories for studying what happens next.
Like the bombina toads in Europe, the yellow-bellied and fire-bellied toads. Their hybrids don't do so well.
They really don't. They have high mortality rates, malformations, and that low fitness is key. It means their mixed genes don't really spread outside that narrow zone. When we study these zones, we see one of three possible long-term outcomes.
Okay, outcome number one, reinforcement.
This happens when the hybrids are way less fit. Natural selection then favors any trait that helps individuals avoid mating with the other species. So the prezygotic barriers get stronger, the species border gets reinforced.
And outcome two is fusion. It sounds like they just give up.
In a way, they do. The reproductive barriers break down, and the two species merge back into one. We saw this in Lake Victoria. Agricultural runoff made the water so murky that the female sexualids couldn't see the male colors anymore.
So the behavioral barrier just collapsed.
It collapsed, massive hybridization occurred, and sadly, several distinct species were lost. They fused back together.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how fragile these barriers can be.
It is. And the third outcome is stability. The hybrid zone just stays there. Hybrids keep being produced, often because there's a steady stream of individuals migrating in from the parent populations. The Bombina toad zone is like this.
And we're learning that hybridization isn't always a dead end. Sometimes it can even be beneficial.
That's a key insight, yeah. It can be a source of new genetic variation. There's evidence that insecticide resistance has been transferred between different species of mosquitoes through hybridization.
Let's turn to time. How fast does this all happen? We hear about the gradual model, slow and steady, versus punctuated equilibria long periods of nothing, then a sudden burst of change.
Right. And the fossil record often seems to support that punctuated model. New species appear pretty abruptly and then don't change much for millions of years.
So which one is it?
Well, the apparent contradiction sort of resolves itself when you think about scale. The speciation event itself, once it gets going, can happen really fast, geologically
A
speaking.
flash in the pan.
Exactly. But the average time between speciation events is huge, millions of years. So it's not a constant ticking clock. It suggests speciation needs a trigger, an external event to kick off that rapid change.
And what about the genetics? Does it take a huge genetic overhaul to create a new species?
Surprisingly, no. Sometimes it can be just a few genes. We mentioned the Japanese snail. A single gene controls that shell coiling, which creates an immediate mechanical barrier.
So a single mutation can start it all.
It can, but when you get to something more complex, like hybrid sterility, that usually involves a lot more genetic mismatches.
I see.
In fruit flies, hybrid sterility can involve at least 4 different genes working against each other. So it can start small, but that final solid wall between species is usually built from many genetic bricks.
So when you put it all together, speciation starts with something tiny, a change in a single gene or a new mating dance. But the cumulative effect of these splits over millions of years is what created the entire tree of life. It connects the micro-changes we see today to the grand macro history of life.
That's a perfect summary. To recap, it's all driven by evolving reproductive isolation. That isolation can be geographic allopatric or internal sympatric. And when diverging populations meet again, their boundaries are either reinforced, fused, or just stay stable.
And that relentless process of division is the reason our planet is filled with such incredible, mind-boggling diversity. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the origin of species.